Our first reading this morning is from the 22nd chapter of Genesis, and the reading may show you why I would just as soon not have a children's message rooted in it. This is a most difficult passage. How it is that I heard it many times as a child, and it didn't scare me half to death, I'm not really sure. May say something about the way Bible stories were perceived by me as almost fairy tales. But let us listen now for what God would say to us through these words. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." And Abraham said, "Here I am." God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of Yahweh called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "Yahweh will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of Yahweh it shall be provided." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. From time to time over the years, I have wondered whether we might not ought to use the updated version of the Lord's Prayer rather than the traditional one that we say each week. If you're like me, you learned that traditional Lord's Prayer growing up. It's something many of us can say without thinking much about it, and it rolls easily off the tongue, but the language is a bit archaic. I mean, who says "thy" anymore? And "lead us not into temptation." I don't know, I think I like the newer version better. "Do not bring us into the time of trial." I don't know if you've ever thought about the Lord's Prayer very much, but it has within it several short petitions we ask for ourselves. We ask for daily bread, for forgiveness, and for protection from testing, trials, temptation, if you will. This prayer that Jesus gives us seems to say that we depend on God for three essential things: for our daily sustenance, for daily bread; for forgiveness, that is, being restored to right relationship with God and others; and finally, for help in testing and trials and temptation. The prayer seems to assume that testing is a part of faith, but it asks that God not bring us into it, that God not cause us to face more than we could bear. And I found myself thinking about the Lord's Prayer as I struggled with this very difficult reading from Genesis, where God tests Abraham by telling him to kill his son. Now, the notion that God would tell someone to kill their own child is troubling enough. But if you know the story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, you know that this threatens the very promise that God has made to Abraham from the beginning. God has promised to make of Abraham a great nation, which naturally requires descendants. And even though Abraham is old and Sarah is barren, God has promised that they will have a child. Now Abraham and Sarah have tried to sort of help the promise along via a child born through Sarah's servant girl Hagar. But God has insisted that this promise is a child for Abraham and Sarah. And Isaac is the fulfillment of this promise. Isaac is the promise embodied. But now God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and there offer him as a burnt offering on the mountain that I shall show you. And despite the horrific nature of this command, Abraham, that consummate man of faith, responds just as he did when he first met God and heard God say, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Now, just as then, once more Abraham goes without a word, even though this new command threatens all that Abraham holds dear. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann has pointed out that there is a striking symmetry in this story in Genesis. 3 times Abraham is addressed, and each time he responds, "Here I am." In the first and third of those times, Abraham simply does what God or God's messenger says to do. But in the middle exchange, Abraham speaks a second time. Abraham responds to Isaac's question about there not being a lamb, saying, God himself will provide. And the whole story hinges on that hope. Give us our daily bread. Save us from trial and testing. You know, most religious people are happy with a God who provides. But a God who tests, who demands absolute loyalty even when it threatens our hopes and dreams and plans, that is troubling, even disturbing. But if we religious sorts are prone to seek a God of provision only, much of modern life and the modern world is organized on the premise that God neither tests nor provides. America worships the self-made man or the self-made woman, the one who is beholding to no one, dependent on no one. The hubris found in much of American business, the obscenely widening pay gap between executive and worker, the collapse in 2008 of the financial house of cards constructed by those who run our financial system. All of this bespeaks an arrogance that imagines itself neither dependent on nor beholding to anything or anyone. And even religious folks such as us have more or less said, well, that's just the way things are. And we've relegated God off to some vague spiritual realm where God holds court. And we can scarcely imagine a primitive God like the one in Genesis who demands terrifying loyalty, but who also provides. Give us our daily bread. Save us from trials and testing. There is something primitive about this story in Genesis, and it offends our modern sensibilities. We're too sophisticated for such a God. We expect our God to be rational and reasonable, as sophisticated as we are. And we want nothing to do with a God who is dangerous, who puts us in difficult situations, whose sovereignty will not adjust to us. Many Christians that I know deal with this difficult story by relegating it to the Old Testament, to another time, another era when there were different rules. To be honest, I'm not sure how much that helps. But it does conveniently forget that Jesus himself finds himself facing a very similar situation to that of Abraham. God calls him to go to the cross. And it is clear from Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane that he does not want to. This is a severe test. But in the end, much like Abraham, Jesus goes, trusting that somehow, even in the face of death, God indeed will provide. And of course, Jesus says to all of us who would be his disciples, take up your cross and follow me. Give us our daily bread. Save us from trial and temptation. Provision and testing. In this Genesis story, there is a striking, stark tension between provision and testing. A tension that I think a lot of us would like to exclude from our particular religious lives. But as frightening and primitive as the story is, I am not sure that genuine faith can exist outside of this tension between provision and testing. For that matter, I'm not sure that any deep and abiding relationship can exist outside this tension. Human beings are created. We're made for relationships. And so we all need things that we cannot get on our own, that we must receive from another. But deep relationships such as a marriage, require trust and commitment. And while trust and commitment are generally easy to give at the beginnings of such relationships, We all know that marriages must stand the test of time. Over time, couples will likely face moments when some other path looks more inviting or easier. We'll face times when it would seem that one's needs could be met somewhere else. And they must live in that tension of testing and provision for the long haul, dealing with daily bread and temptation, before at some point we can say, now that is a sound and good marriage. Now, I am more than happy to blame some of the more terrifying aspects of today's Old Testament reading on it being the product of a violent culture, a culture where sacrifice, even human sacrifice, was well known. I'm willing to assign some of its primitive aspects to the dustbin of history. But I fear that this in no way mitigates the vital dynamic of faith it bears witness to, this tension of provision and testing, daily bread and temptation. Jesus invites each and every one of us to follow Him, and in so doing to discover the shape and meaning of our true humanity, and to find as well the grace and love and hope that God has for each of us. But following Jesus is an act of radical trust. We can only walk the path Jesus shows us by turning away from some others, by rejecting the siren calls of consumerism and consumption, by rejecting the urge to hate and to hurt, by loving and giving ourselves for others just as Jesus did. To follow Him, we must make choices and decisions, some of them quite difficult. Choices to follow Him and not some others. To not walk some very popular paths. Give us our daily bread. Save us from trial and testing. I'd like to think that this story of sacrificing of Isaac is more metaphor than history. But even then, it is still a bit frightening. Yet Abraham is able to go, and we are able to live faithfully, even in the face of difficulty, fears, and uncertainties. Only in this hope that sustains Abraham, this hope that sustains Jesus on the cross, this hope that God indeed will provide, that in the end is the hope and the promise of resurrection. God will provide. Thanks be to God.